Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris, and today I'm here to talk to you about an article I found through Stockton's library entitled Planning Lessons for Students with Significant Disabilities in High School English Classes. And the first thing I want to note is that this title is a bit misleading. So what it's really about is this concept up here in this little blue text box, which is this idea of adapted texts, which means how do we adapt certain novels, plays, short stories, poems, whatever that we teach in the class to help students with disabilities better engage and interact with that material, that content. So rather than just giving everyone the same copy of William Golding's novel, Lord of the Flies, or William Shakespeare's Macbeth, how do we figure out what is a better way to deliver that content based on the various learners that we have in front of us, whether they have IEPs, 504s, or just different needs that you come to learn over the course of the school year. So I chose this article for two reasons. One is that I find it difficult to locate sources specifically about high school classes in general, but then high school English classes in particular. So I like the fact that right in the title, I knew immediately that this was going to apply to me and hopefully give me some tips that I'd be able to implement starting in the new week. The second reason I chose this is because I was under the false impression that I knew what it meant to create an adaptive text as we did our Meeting Students Learning Needs Portfolio project in our summer seminar with Dr. Tracy Bronson. Apparently I did not know what it really means to create an adapted text, and that it's not enough to just give a student an audio recording of a book. That might be a good start, but for students with more significant disabilities, that's probably not going to be where you can just end. It's just a start. So what's helpful about this article is that it breaks everything down into 6 easy steps, and some of them are more complex than others. So let's begin with how do we define what an adapted text is? And the authors do that very concisely for us right here in this paragraph. They say that an adaptive text might be brief passages, key words, paired with images, repeated lines to emphasize main ideas, multiple media formats and characteristics, anything like that. So you can kind of pick and choose from this buffet of different options you have when it comes to creating an adapted text. And what's nice is that this table right over here on the right gives you low-tech options and high-tech options depending on how much time you have, what types of learners you have in front of you, all that sort of thing. So I'm not going to go into that in more detail, but I like the fact that there was a very concise visual to go along with all this other information. So one of the things that I really enjoyed about this article was how the authors at the very beginning were trying to be respectful of the fact that not every teacher is going to have a bunch of time to really create an adaptive text. So they say that, we might not have the time to adapt materials in addition to focusing on all the other skills that we need to be teaching our students in order to help them transition to adulthood. So whether adulthood be going right into a career or into college and beyond. So I like that, although I think at times that some of their suggestions kind of lose sight of this idea of being respectful of time constraints. So our first step, we're going to dive right into this, is outlining the story. So what's nice is that they say that it does not have to be super detailed. So at this point, you're just creating a bare bones version of the story, and they are literally encouraging teachers to use something like SparkNotes or Cliff Notes in order to get a sense of the story, especially if they don't have time to read the whole book in advance. And I know we typically try not to tell students to rely solely on SparkNotes or Cliff Notes. So I think that the authors are also trying to be aware or be cognizant of the fact that we want to practice what we preach in this sense, so that the SparkNotes and Cliff Notes information that we're getting is just creating the very basic outline of the story. And that's going to be our jumping off point for the rest of our adaptive process here. So once we have that general story arc down, we then want to start identifying key themes in the book. And what we want to do with that is, in our outline, figure out where do key themes occur in that text, whether it be in a play like Romeo and Juliet, so what lines, scenes, acts, etc., or what chapters if we're doing a novel or something like that. So making sure that we know exactly at what point in the novel or play are we going to be highlighting different themes. So whether it be something like family or conflict or civil versus savage behavior, like in William Golding's Lord of the Flies, we want to know exactly when we're teaching those themes. So our third step is then to figure out what vocabulary at various points in that text are important. And although the authors mention it, I still don't think that it might have been most helpful to emphasize that we want to start with vocabulary that students don't already know. And we should already be aware of that. We're not going to be retreading old territory the entire time. We want to focus on vocabulary development, not just re-emphasizing words they already know. And what's important to keep in mind here is that we want to make sure that we choose vocabulary based on the individual needs of our students. So depending on what their IEPs or 504s dictate in terms of vocabulary comprehension, vocabulary retention, we want to make sure we're not choosing too many words or too few, or words that are too difficult for that particular student's skill set at the given time that we're teaching the text. But making sure that those words then relate to that theme. So we're not choosing words, just random words. We want to make sure that we're following these steps and we're building on all of them so that we're taking the themes, we're taking the vocabulary, and then we're going to tie them accordingly throughout the text. So we have our vocabulary in mind. We're going to start thinking about how do we teach those students the vocabulary in the context of the text, but also in the context of real life. Because as the authors mentioned, when it comes to students with disabilities, they're more likely to learn vocabulary if we use it in natural contexts. So whether it be in conversation unrelated to the book or in conversation related to the specific text. So once we have our vocabulary chosen, we then want to figure out, okay, in our outline, what are the absolute key events that we have in mind here? That way we can start filling in the blanks. And again, keeping in mind what's going to be too complex for certain students and what's going to be not complex enough for other students. So we want to make sure that we are then being very respectful of the original genre. So we want to make sure that we keep things like exposition if we're reading a Western, as the authors mentioned here, or that we keep certain features of a play, whether we have asides or things for like a humorous moment, like in Macbeth. We kind of release that. Making sure that we keep generic features as intact as possible and as appropriate. So we have all of these 4 steps down. We have vocabulary, themes, and events. We then want to start writing the adapted text. And this is where I believe the authors start kind of getting off track a little bit in terms of losing sight of how much time might we actually have to create this adapted text. So although they're saying that we can use low-tech options like Google Slides or PowerPoint, they then transition into this discussion of, oh, we'll print it out, laminate it, bind it, all that kind of good stuff. And we want to be respectful of the fact that not all teachers are going to have the same amount of time or the same amount of resources, whether it be the physical resources like lamination or even the resources in terms of finances to go out and create these, unique laminated and bound texts. So I wish the authors would have been a little bit more respectful of those limitations, as awesome as that idea might be to create this laminated and bound text for our students who legitimately do need it. So they also emphasize, again, this idea of genre as we're writing it. So making sure that if we're adapting a play, we have the characters' names appearing before the text. We have things separated into chapters and paragraphs if we're looking at a novel or a short story or a novella, anything like that. And making sure that we have the original language as much as possible. So paraphrasing when it might be too difficult, but when we have key lines, like for instance, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo, that line is going to lose a lot of its resonance and literary importance if we try to rephrase it. So making sure that we're identifying what are key lines in the original text that we really need to keep the integrity of, but then rephrasing as appropriate. Okay, so we then have our text adapted, however long it took us, hopefully not too long. We then want to choose pictures. And this is especially helpful for those of our students who might not focus as much when there's just blocks of text on a page. So even if we're looking at this article outline or this article that we have in front of us, there's no pictures. And even for some of us, we might start tuning out. So we want to make sure that we're choosing pictures that really do enhance the text. We don't want the students to become so focused on those pictures that they lose focus on the words themselves. We want to find that nice balance of alphabetic text and multimodal text. So once we then have those pictures, we are pretty much ready to go in terms of giving that student the text to be able to use in class. And I think this is where the authors really missed the mark, where we only really have this last page, because once we turn the page, it's the conclusion. So they really don't dive in to how exactly do we start implementing this text, especially when we have students who might then be using different versions of the text. How do we cohere those students? That way we don't have students with one type of text over here on the left and students with another type of text on the right. We want to make sure, as it says right here, that we have structured peer interactions to make sure that everyone is engaging with the text at their level, but at the same time and in an interactive way. And I believe Joe actually did his podcast on this idea of valuable peer interactions. So perhaps then we could spend some time thinking about this article in relation to the article that Joe talked about, especially because students who are using the more traditional text, even if they don't have a disability, they might benefit from that more interactive or adapted text, just for one reason or another, even if it's just more engaging, and that's a perfectly reasonable explanation. And at the very end of the day, regardless if we're using peer interactions or we're using structured independent study, we want to make sure that we're focusing on comprehension and being able to transfer those comprehension skills, not just in a literacy context, but also in a real world context, so that a student understands that I can have a conversation with someone about a book and it demonstrates my comprehension, just as it would if I'm in the class with my teacher and my peers answering a series of questions or writing an essay to demonstrate my comprehension. So whatever performance-based assessment, it can be real-world oriented or it can be classroom oriented. We want to make sure that we keep both of those things in mind. So where do we go from this? Well, as I said before, I think we have important skills outlined here in this box, but I really feel like the authors fail to make good on their title, which is planning lessons with these students in mind. What does this lesson look like? I think that's where more research can really be done, because obviously as educators, whether we're in a co-taught class or in a regular or a general education class without a co-teacher, we know that students can benefit from different types of texts. So it would really be helpful to understand and to know what are the actual steps that we take to implementing those texts, rather than just thinking about how do we create that text. That's a huge step and a very time-consuming step, but all of that time won't mean anything if we don't understand how to implement that text through lesson-by-lesson instruction. So I guess that's food for thought. And I apologize if this was a little bit longer than I anticipated, but I hope that it was helpful for all of you as well. I'll see you all later. Bye-bye.